these problems from worksheet number 2 tend to be pretty difficult when the first time you try them, so I'm going to talk through the first problem with you. Let me tell you how I approach a problem like this. There are two parameters outside of the cosine function, and there are two parameters inside the cosine function. I start with the ones outside and figure out how my y values are affected in this function. So I start with the sinusoidal axis, which is 5. So that is at the line, basically y equals 5. There's a horizontal line that represents the sinusoidal axis. The amplitude is equal to 7, which means the high point of my graph is going to be the sinusoidal axis plus the amplitude, which would be a high of 12, and the low point of the graph would be the sinusoidal axis minus the amplitude, which is going to be -2. So I know that on the y-axis, my three key points that I'm going to need to look at are the sinusoidal axis, the high point, and the low point. Then I look at the x values, the things inside the function. So the first thing, so I'm going to actually label these. This is c, the sinusoidal axis. This is a, the amplitude. This is d, the phase displacement, and this is b, which is not called anything except b but it affects the period. So d is the phase displacement. That is the starting point of the cycle. So when we talk about the starting point, we're talking about the starting point in the x direction. So the cycle starts at x equals 4. It means the whole graph has shifted to the right 4 because we subtracted 4 inside the function. The period is determined by looking at b. The period is equal to 2 pi divided by b. So in this case, it's going to be 2 pi divided by pi over 2.5. So that is the same thing as saying 2 pi times 2.5 over pi. In other words, we're dividing 2 pi by pi, which just gives us 2, but then we're also dividing by 1 over 2.5, which is the same as saying it's going to be 2.5 greater. So the period ends up being 5. Now, the number 5 is not necessarily a number I label anywhere on the graph because that just tells me how long it is to get from the beginning of the cycle to the end of the cycle. If the beginning of the cycle starts at x equals 4 and the entire cycle is 5 units long, then the end of the cycle will be at x equals 9. So the end point is going to be x equals 4 plus 5, which is 9. Now when I graph, I always start with the starting point and the ending point. And then I work from those to find the middle points on the x-axis. So I'm going to save those for later. So to graph this, I'm going to need a y-axis that goes from -2 to 12. So I'm going to just put -2 down here, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. The only other key point I need to know is where y equals 5, because that is the sinusoidal axis. Always put that in with the dotted line first, because we're going to need to draw things using the sinusoidal axis. On the x-axis, I just need 4 and 9. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And you know what? I think I'm going to spread those out a little more because I have a feeling that that's going to make my graph really crowded. So let me make my x values a little farther apart. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, that'll be easier to draw. Okay, so I know this is a cosine cycle. A cosine cycle has 5 key points. It looks like this. The sinusoidal axis cuts right down the middle. So I am looking for high point on the sinusoidal axis, middle point which is low, point on the sinusoidal axis, and then a high point. I'm going to start with the 2 high points because I know those are the beginning and the end of the cycle. I know the high point of my graph in the y direction is 12, and the starting point and ending points are 4 and 9 on the x-axis, so one of my points is going to be up here at 412, and the other point's going to be here at 912. Now, you do not have to label the points and label the axes. You know, if you've got the labels over here and here, I'll assume that's what it means, but I'm just going to put those up here just so you know exactly what I'm doing. Now the next thing I'm going to do is find the low point, because that's right in the middle, halfway between 4 and 9. Well, halfway between 4 and 9 is not a whole number. Halfway between 4 and 9 is 6.5. I can figure that out just by counting the tick marks and see that I have to take, there's 5 and this would be 2.5 and this would be 2.5. Or I can say 4 plus 9 is 13 and 13 divided by 2 is 6.5. So that means I have my low point, which I didn't really leave enough room for because of my big number here, so I'm going to make this a little bit tinier. My low point then is right here at -2, 6.5. Now I have 2 points on the sinusoidal axis. I know that in the y direction the y coordinate will be 5, but the x coordinate has to be halfway between 4 and 6.5 and halfway between 6.5 and 9. So how do I do halfway between? Actually, I've got one of them written down already. Halfway between 6.5 and 9 is 6. If I average the two, it's 7.75. This is 2.5. So basically I'm adding 1 1/4 or 1.25 to 6.5. So 1.25 would get me about right here at 7.75. Now between 4 and 6.5, I have 4 plus 6.5 divided by 2. That's 10.5 divided by 2, or 5.25. 1 1/4 away from 4. 5.25. So my key points on the x-axis, I'm just going to mark them in red, are these points, and they have to be evenly spaced. All right. So if sometimes you're going to end up with decimal numbers to get those exactly in between points. All right. So this is the point here, 5.255, and this is the point 7.75, 5. Now I'm ready to draw the graph. So it curves down here, and then up, concave up below the sinusoidal axis. Now I could continue this graph. It would keep going and go down and up again. It was going to keep going this way. So I know it's going to keep going, but I just am going to require you to draw one cycle. Now how do we check this on the calculator? What I'm going to do on my calculator is graph this equation and change my window settings so that I can see if exactly one cycle fits between -2 and 12 on the y-axis and between 4 and 9 on the x-axis. So let's take a look at the calculator. On your scratch pad, if you push the scratch pad button twice, you'll get to a graph. If your graph already has something on it, you can push Dock B, and that will clear everything off and start you over again. It will also clear off the main page of your scratch pad. So let's put in the equation. So 5 plus 7 cosine. Now, you do need to use the pi symbol, which is under the pi button. Pi divided by 2.5. Open a new set of parentheses, x minus 4, and then make sure you go outside of both sets of parentheses. Actually I added the 5 at the beginning. If you're adding something at the end instead, if you added 5 at the end instead of at the beginning, then make sure to go outside the parentheses. But I'm actually done with my equation. Now I don't want to see this view. I would like to see what I drew, the view of what I drew on my paper. So I'm going to go to Menu and Window Zoom and Window Settings, and I'm going to change the window settings to match my beginning and ending points in the x direction, which are 4 and 9, and then my high and low, and actually low first, -2 and 12 in the y direction. Push OK. Notice what I have here is one complete cosine cycle. Now if I wanted to see more, like since I started at 0 on my paper, if I want to go change to window settings and change my x min to 0 so I can see sort of what it would look like going back down. So here's the cycle I drew right here, and then this would be the rest going down. Now we could double check a couple of the points too. If I go to Menu, Trace, and Graph Trace, when you're in Trace you can hover over here and it says enter a number to jump to that independent value. So independent is x. So if I wanted to double check, say that one of my middle points was correct, and I type in 5.25, I should see that I am on the sinusoidal axis, which is 5. You can even draw in the sinusoidal axis if you want to. If you go to tab, that'll allow you to open another equation, and actually if you tab and go up, that goes back to your original equation. But I'm just going to type in 5. So there's my sinusoidal axis. That kind of helps me visualize where things are. So if I typed in that, if I go to menu and trace and graph trace again, and I type, see that 5.255 is landing right on the sinusoidal axis. So that kind of helps visualize it as well. So hopefully that's helpful in doing the first problem. I'm also going to make a short video about the second problem and just how it's different when you have pi on the axis.